I'm glad you can make it here for today's lesson. We are again in the book of Daniel, and we have a very interesting story today, I have to say. Now, one thing I do want to say is that in telling you the story about the fiery furnace and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I left out the opportunity for you to learn a new song. So I want to start with that first. I am not going to sing because that's not a pleasant sound to hear, but I will hold up the paper that shows the lyrics. And what you may want to do is freeze the screen at this point, and then you can copy these down if you want to learn it. But it's in the tradition of several of the Psalms because what I did, I took a pre existing song and I wrote different words to it. And it's a way to help learn the lesson from that. And you'll notice through a lot of the Psalms in the Bible that it'll say to the tune of and give the name of another song, which is pretty interesting. And as I said, it's a good way to learn the uh, words that you're trying to remember. Okay, with today's lesson, we're back with Nebuchadnezzar. This is pretty much the last time we'll talk about him, and um, I think partly why things are wrapping up for him is that he has been so in need of learning something from God all along. He's been learning little bits, but never quite getting what he's supposed to understand. In this story, it starts off with his having a dream. Sounds very similar to the first time we met him, or really our second story on that, where he had a dream. This one's a different dream. It still terrifies him, but this time he's decided that he will let all of his wise men hear what the dream is and have them try to tell him what it means. So he calls them in, and he has not called in Daniel at this point, but calls in some of the other men, and they can't tell him what it means, even when he tells them the dream. So he calls in Daniel. Now, at this point, we find that Daniel is on his own. We aren't going to hear from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego again. And I wondered about that for a while, but then I realized wait, after their bout with the fiery furnace, they were promoted. So it's entirely possible that they were given jobs that were outside of Babylon. And so they just didn't make it back to the city for this. So now Daniel doesn't have his friends with him. But we find that that's not going to hinder him in any way because he has a job to do. Everyone thinks it's advisor to the king, head of Babylon, and all that. His real job is serving God. These other things are secondary, and he never loses sight of that. So, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is about a tree. We're talking about a huge tree, and it's a fruit tree. And the tree is so big that it goes all the way up to the heavens. That's a tall tree, and it's got branches, it's got fruit, and animals live under it and in it. Okay, that so far that sounds like a pretty good dream. But then an angel shows up and orders that the tree be cut down. The tree is cut down, and not only cut down, but the limbs are cut off of it, the leaves are stripped off of it, and the fruit is scattered from it. So we're talking about this tree has been uh, ruined completely, except for one part. The stump is left in place in the ground, and the roots are still there. And so normally we would say, okay, that means a dead tree. But it's not always the case. There's a type of tree called the chestnut. Because of disease, it's been pretty much wiped out. Anything above the ground, but there are a lot of chestnut trees that are still alive because their roots are still alive. The roots are still in the ground. So that's what we have here. So it's disturbing because there's this stump, and then the angel has it bound with iron and bronze. And Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel, okay, so what does this mean? And Daniel thinks for a second, and then he's scared because he realizes what it means. And he says, oh, King, I wish this was about one of your enemies, but it's not. It's about you. you're the tree, and you're going to have everything taken away from you, but you're not going to be killed from this. And he said, the thing to do at this point, this is a judgment from God, the real God. And if you turn away from the evil that you do and you are good to the people, then maybe these things won't happen to you. Well, we don't know what Nebuchadnezzar does right away. It's actually possible that he did take Daniel's advice to start with, but a year later, if anything, he is worse than he was before. And he's looking around and he's going, yes, this is a magnificent city I've built. Look, this is wonderful. All of these buildings. We've got the Hanging Gardens. And by the way, the Hanging Gardens are something that he apparently constructed for his wife. And that was considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And the seven wonders just means that great things that were built that were very impressive. The only one of those wonders that still exist are the pyramids in Egypt. And even those have been stripped down a little bit from what they were at their best. But the Hanging Gardens were something that people would discuss and talk about and say, oh, these are great. And so he's very proud of himself that he's had all this done and everything looks good and he's the ruler of all. And he's so pleased with himself. He is saying this, and before his words end, he gets struck down. Now, Daniel had warned him what was going to happen. I mean, he had elaborated what his being struck down was going to mean, is that you're going to be living like an animal and you won't have your right mind, and in fact, you won't even come in out of the rain. You'll be outside and it'll start raining and you just stay there in it. And you'll be eating grass too, just like the cattle. Well, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar is in this very position. And the one thing, he can't really think about all of this stuff now. He can't think clearly because he's thinking like an animal. But Daniel had said this is going to last 7 times. Now, a lot of people thinking it's probably correct that 7 times meant 7 years. And that's often the way people would discuss things. But remember, in our last lesson, 7 can also mean the maximum or until something is complete. So it's possible that this didn't have to take 7 years before Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson, or it could have taken longer than 7 years. In any event, Nebuchadnezzar was living like an animal. He was eating grass, which people really can't eat and be healthy, but he was doing that. He was getting rained on and just living outside. Well, somebody must have been running things for him because he was in no shape to run the country himself. An interesting thing is however long this lasted, it did take long enough so that his fingernails grew all long like claws. I think his toenails would have been part of that too, so that'd been pretty gross. And his hair was like feathers on a bird, meaning that it would have been all messed up, not even brushed or combed or anything. He'd looked like a wild man, and in fact, he was a wild man. So finally, one day he looked up to heaven, he came to his senses, and he acknowledged the lesson that was primary in all of this. It was that God can choose who to rule a particular country, and if he doesn't want them in there, they're going to be gone. If he wants them in there, there's nothing that can stop them from being in there. God is in control of that. Nebuchadnezzar finally learned this lesson, and it was important for him. Now, interestingly enough, the Bible doesn't tell us this part, but archaeologists who have studied Babylon and dug up some things tell us, yes, Babylon was a magnificent city. and it's got the most ruins and archaeological sites in the Middle East for anyone to dig into. And they found a lot about Nebuchadnezzar and then how splendid his kingdom was. But interestingly enough, a couple of the kings that followed him um, didn't last very long. And the one who was king, when our next story is told, may not even have been related to Nebuchadnezzar. One of the things in a poem that was written about him during the time he was crazy was saying that he didn't pay attention to his sons or his daughters and didn't even care for them. And you have to think just how bad it is for a man to get to that point where he doesn't even know or care about his family. So, one main lesson we can learn from this one is when we have success, we need to thank God for that. Now, secondarily, and much more minor in all of this, is today's tie ties in with this lesson because you'll notice it's covered with cows. And that's to remind us of Nebuchadnezzar eating grass like a cow because he did not follow Daniel's advice and repent and turn back. Well, in his case, it'd be turning to God permanently and following his rules. So, hope to see you next time when we have another lesson from the book of Daniel. But this one's going to have a very interesting twist, and hope you can make it then. Bye.